"You're wrong, my foolish daughter," Dad sneered in court. Then the judge read my military file. The moment my father stood in the witness box and pointed at me, I realized he wasn't trying to win the lawsuit, he wanted to erase me. "You're wrong, my foolish daughter," he sneered loudly enough for every person inside the courtroom to hear. "You've always imagined you were someone important." A few people in the gallery chuckled. My attorney quietly touched my elbow, urging me to stay calm, but the words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't because they hurt anymore. It was because they sounded exactly like they had 20 years earlier when I was 10 years old, standing in our old Kansas kitchen after fixing his truck by myself. He'd laughed then too. "Girls don't become leaders," he'd said while my older brother Ryan stood behind him wearing the smile of someone who knew he'd never be questioned. That same smile was on Ryan's face now as he sat beside Dad in court. They believed today would end exactly the way every family argument had ended, with me walking away and them keeping everything. The lawsuit was over ownership of Walker Logistics, the trucking company my late grandfather had quietly built before handing operational authority to Dad. After Grandpa passed, Dad claimed he'd been promised full ownership forever. I challenged that claim only after discovering financial records suggesting Grandpa intended something entirely different. Dad told everyone I was greedy. Ryan called me bitter. Relatives refused to answer my calls. Even neighbors whispered that I'd returned from the army just to steal my family's company. Nobody asked why I'd stayed silent for years. Nobody wondered why someone with my military pension, savings, and successful consulting career would suddenly fight for a trucking business. They simply accepted Dad's version because it was easier than believing the quiet daughter he'd dismissed her whole life might actually be telling the truth. Across the courtroom, Dad folded his arms confidently while Ryan whispered, "She's about to embarrass herself." They had no idea I wasn't here because of the company. I was here because 6 months earlier, Grandpa's old attorney had mailed me a sealed envelope with one handwritten sentence across the front. "Open only if your father forces you into court." I still remembered my hands shaking when I opened it. Inside were copies of letters, legal documents, and one short note from Grandpa. "Emily, if you're reading this, then your father chose pride over family. Do not protect him anymore." Those words had haunted me every night since. I looked toward the judge, who calmly organized several folders while the court clerk stacked exhibits onto a wooden table. One folder rested apart from the others, sealed with a red government label. Nobody had mentioned it during discovery. Even my attorney looked confused. Before I could ask about it, the bailiff approached the bench and quietly handed the judge another envelope. The judge frowned, opened it, and slowly looked in my direction with an expression I couldn't read. Dad mistook the silence for victory. "Your Honor," he announced confidently, "my daughter spent years pretending she sacrificed everything for this family, but she abandoned us. She disappeared into the military because she couldn't handle responsibility." Ryan nodded dramatically. "Grandpa begged her to come home," he added. "She ignored him." Every word was a lie, yet hearing them spoken under oath felt different. My attorney rose immediately. "Objection. The witness is testifying to matters already disproven in deposition." The judge allowed limited questioning, and suddenly every eye turned toward me. I stepped into the witness box without rushing. My heartbeat was steady. Years earlier, during my final overseas deployment, I'd learned that panic solved nothing. Precision did. "Ms. Walker," my attorney began, "why did you enlist?" Dad rolled his eyes before I answered. "Because she wanted attention." The judge shot him a warning glance, and I finally spoke. "I enlisted because my father emptied my college account 3 weeks before orientation and told me no daughter of his deserved an engineering degree." The room became noticeably quieter. Dad laughed dismissively. "She always exaggerates." My attorney held up old bank statements. "These withdrawals carry your signature, Mr. Walker." Dad's smile weakened for only a second before he shrugged. "It was my money." "Actually," my attorney replied, "the account originated from a trust established solely by Mr. Harold Walker, the plaintiff's grandfather." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. That fact had never been shared with him. My attorney continued. "After losing access to her tuition, what happened next?" I answered honestly. "I worked nights for 6 months, but tuition deadlines passed. The Army recruiter didn't promise me riches. He promised me opportunity. I expected sympathy. Instead, I saw surprise. Most people had believed I'd enlisted out of rebellion. They'd never imagined it was survival." Dad interrupted again. "She acts like she's some war hero. She filed paperwork behind desks." I almost smiled. That accusation followed me everywhere because I never corrected people. Some secrets weren't mine alone. My attorney reached for another document but stopped when the judge unexpectedly raised a hand. "Counsel," the judge said, studying the sealed government folder again, "before we continue, I need clarification regarding newly submitted federal records." My attorney blinked. "Your Honor?" "These records were delivered directly through authorized channels this morning." Dad leaned back confidently. Probably another exaggeration. The judge ignored him and slowly broke the government seal. Several pages slid across the bench. His eyes moved from one page to another, then stopped. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. The judge looked at me differently now, not with sympathy, but with unmistakable respect. He reread one paragraph, adjusted his glasses, and quietly asked, "Ms. Walker, why was this information withheld from the court?" Before I could answer, a sharply dressed man I'd never seen before entered through the courtroom doors accompanied by 2 uniformed military officers. Every conversation stopped instantly. The stranger carried a black leather case marked with a federal security insignia. He wasn't dressed like an attorney, yet everyone instinctively made room as he approached the bench. The bailiff checked his credentials only briefly before stepping aside. My father's confidence finally cracked. "Who is that?" he whispered to Ryan. Neither of them received an answer. The man leaned toward the judge and spoke quietly enough that the gallery couldn't hear, but I recognized several familiar phrases. "Department authorization." "Classified service." "Declassification approved." My stomach tightened. I had spent years making sure that part of my life never reached my hometown. Not because I was ashamed, but because some promises survive long after missions end. The judge slowly nodded while the military officers stood perfectly still behind the visitor. One of them glanced toward me, and for the briefest moment, I recognized him. Colonel Marcus Hale. The last time I'd seen him, smoke had filled the night sky halfway across the world, And he'd looked at me after the operation ended and said, "Someday they'll know what you really did. Until then, silence is part of your service." He wasn't supposed to be here. None of this was supposed to happen. Dad suddenly stood. "Your Honor, what does any of this have to do with a family business?" The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the first page of the military file, read several lines in complete silence, then looked directly at my father. The warmth disappeared from his face. "Mr. Walker," he said slowly, "a few moments ago you described your daughter as irresponsible, dishonest, and insignificant." Dad nodded confidently. "Because she is." The judge closed the folder with deliberate care, his voice suddenly carrying across every corner of the courtroom. "I strongly recommend that you choose your next words very carefully." The room fell into absolute silence. Then the judge lifted the classified file, looked straight at me, and said, "Ms. Walker, before this court proceeds, I believe everyone here deserves to know exactly who you are." No one breathed. The judge held the military file in both hands as though it weighed far more than paper. My father scoffed, trying to recover the confidence that had carried him through the morning. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we're here over ownership of a trucking company, not some made-up military story." His voice echoed through the courtroom, but nobody laughed this time. Even Ryan's smug grin had disappeared. The two military officers remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed ahead with the discipline of people who understood that history was about to change. The sharply dressed federal representative nodded once toward the judge, giving silent permission to continue. The judge opened the file again and read aloud. "The Department of Defense confirms that Staff Sergeant Emily Walker served with distinction during multiple classified operations. Portions of her service record remained sealed under federal authority until this morning." A ripple of whispers swept through the gallery. My father shook his head. "Impossible. She told everyone she worked logistics." I finally looked at him. "Because I was ordered to." His face tightened. He searched mine for the insecure daughter he had spent years humiliating, but she no longer existed. The judge continued. "This file further states that Ms. Walker voluntarily declined public recognition, medals presented in open ceremony, and multiple interviews requested after her retirement." Ryan leaned toward Dad. "She's lying, right?" Dad didn't answer. He couldn't. The federal representative calmly placed another envelope on the bench. "There is additional documentation authorized for public release." The judge opened it, scanned the pages, and his expression became even more serious. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "your daughter was never hiding failure. She was protecting classified service that even this court was not permitted to access until today." The silence became heavier than any argument. Reporters who had wandered into court expecting an ordinary inheritance dispute suddenly reached for their notebooks. My attorney looked at me with genuine surprise. Even she hadn't known everything. I'd only shared what was legally permitted. The judge glanced toward Colonel Marcus Hale. "Colonel, would you care to clarify the record?" The colonel stepped forward, stopping only after receiving permission from the bench. His decorated uniform caught the afternoon light, and every movement reflected decades of command. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to briefing presidents and generals rather than county judges. I personally supervised Staff Sergeant Walker during one of the most sensitive rescue operations conducted by our unit. Dad folded his arms. Military people protect their own. The colonel turned toward him without raising his voice. No, sir. We protect the truth. Every eye remained locked on him. There were 12 Americans trapped behind hostile lines after an intelligence failure. Extraction had become impossible. 3 separate plans collapsed. Staff Sergeant Walker volunteered for an option no commanding officer wanted to approve because survival odds were almost non-existent. The courtroom fell completely silent. She crossed into hostile territory with a 4-person team, located the missing personnel, and refused evacuation after suffering injuries because 2 civilians remained unaccounted for. My father's face slowly lost its color. Ryan blinked repeatedly as if trying to wake from a dream. The colonel continued. 21 lives returned home because of decisions she made that night. A woman in the gallery quietly covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "My God." The colonel wasn't finished. When offered the nation's highest recommendations for extraordinary valor, she asked only one question. He paused before looking directly at me. She asked whether public recognition would endanger the families of people still serving overseas. When informed that publicity carried risk, she refused every interview, every headline, and every television appearance. He turned back toward the judge. I've commanded soldiers for 31 years. Very few have demonstrated that level of courage without asking for recognition. My father stared at me in stunned silence. The daughter he had mocked as weak had carried secrets that even the federal government had protected. Before anyone could process the revelation, the federal representative requested permission to address the court. Your Honor, these military records explain only part of today's proceedings. He opened the black leather case and removed several financial files. Our office has been conducting a separate investigation into Walker Logistics for the past 11 months. Dad suddenly stood. Investigation? The representative nodded. Yes, sir. He laid photographs, banking records, and corporate documents across the evidence table. The investigation began after unusual financial transfers triggered federal reporting requirements. Ryan's confidence shattered. Dad, what is he talking about? My father ignored him. This has nothing to do with my daughter. Actually, the representative replied, it has everything to do with her. He looked toward the judge. If Ms. Walker had not filed this civil action challenging ownership records, these transactions might never have come to light. The judge slowly examined the documents, his expression growing darker with every page. My attorney leaned closer, clearly seeing something she hadn't expected. The representative continued, preliminary evidence suggests corporate assets were transferred through shell companies using forged authorization signatures, including signatures attributed to the late Harold Walker. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Ryan turned toward his father, panic replacing loyalty. Dad, tell them that's not true. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened once again. This time, 3 FBI agents entered carrying sealed evidence boxes. The lead agent walked directly to the bench, handed the judge a federal warrant, then slowly turned toward my father. Richard Walker, he said firmly, before this hearing continues, we need to speak with you regarding several felony offenses. The entire courtroom froze as my father's hands began to tremble for the very first time in his life. My father looked around the courtroom as though someone would rescue him. No one moved. The relatives who had whispered against me all morning suddenly avoided his eyes. Ryan stood halfway out of his chair, frozen between defending his father and protecting himself. The lead FBI agent waited with calm patience, holding the federal warrant in one hand. "Richard Walker," he repeated, "this is not an arrest at this time. However, you are the subject of an active federal investigation involving financial fraud, forged corporate records, wire transfers, and obstruction." Dad forced out a laugh that sounded painfully unnatural. "This is ridiculous. My own daughter planned this." The accusation barely landed before the agent answered. "The investigation began months before Ms. Walker filed this lawsuit." That single sentence shattered the story my father had been telling everyone. His attorney hurried to his feet. "Your Honor, I request a recess." The judge didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reviewed the warrant, then looked toward the federal representative. "Are these allegations supported by independent evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply. "Bank records, email archives, sworn statements, digital forensics, and financial audits conducted by multiple agencies." Ryan slowly backed away from my father as though seeing a stranger for the first time. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, "tell me you didn't forge Grandpa's name." My father didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one standing alone while everyone believed his version of events. The courtroom had turned, not because of emotion, but because the facts had finally caught up with him. The judge called for order as the murmurs grew louder. "Enough," he said firmly. "This court will proceed based on evidence, not speculation." He turned toward me. "Ms. Walker, before today's hearing, did you have any knowledge of this federal investigation?" "No, Your Honor," I answered honestly. "I suspected something was wrong after reviewing Grandpa's records, but I didn't know federal authorities were involved." The FBI agent nodded. "Her statement is consistent with our findings." Then he looked toward my father. "Mr. Walker, we also recovered a recorded voicemail left by Harold Walker approximately 3 weeks before his death." My father's face instantly lost what little color remained. Ryan stared at him. "Grandpa left a voicemail?" The agent carefully removed a digital recorder from an evidence bag. "He did." The judge approved its admission into evidence. The courtroom became so quiet that even the air conditioning seemed loud. The recording began with static, followed by my grandfather's familiar voice, older, weaker, but unmistakable. "If anyone hears this, it's because something happened before I could finish correcting my will. Emily, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I should have protected you sooner." Tears instantly filled my eyes. I hadn't heard Grandpa's voice since the day we buried him. The recording continued. "Your father doesn't know I found the missing records. He believes I've signed everything he wanted. I didn't. The company was never meant to belong to one child. It was supposed to belong to the one who protected this family when no one else would." Several jurors exchanged stunned glances. Grandpa took a slow breath before speaking again. That person was always you, Emily. My father buried his face in his hands. Ryan looked at him with complete disbelief. You lied to us, all these years. Before anyone could recover from the recording, another unexpected figure entered the courtroom. An elderly woman with silver hair walked slowly toward the witness stand, supported by a cane. I recognized her instantly, Margaret Collins, Grandpa's retired executive assistant. I hadn't seen her in nearly 15 years. Dad's eyes widened in panic the moment he saw her. She can't testify, he blurted out. She's confused. Margaret stopped walking and looked directly at him with surprising strength. Richard, she said calmly, I've been waiting 20 years to tell the truth under oath. The judge welcomed her to the witness stand. She carefully opened a worn leather folder that looked older than some people in the courtroom. Inside were handwritten journals, original board meeting notes, and one sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's unmistakable signature. Your Honor, Margaret said, Harold Walker knew someone might try to change his wishes after his death. That's why he asked me to safeguard these originals until the right moment. She handed the envelope to the bailiff. The judge broke the seal, unfolded the document, and silently read the first page. His eyes widened. Then he looked directly at my father. Mr. Walker, he said gravely, according to this original signed declaration, your daughter isn't simply challenging ownership of Walker Logistics. He paused, let